Is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD the fulfillment of the prophecies in the Gospels? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Lord prophesies during his earthly ministry of the destruction of the temple. He specifically speaks of it. Of course, what subsequently happens is in 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. And so many folks look at that and they think about that as, well, what occurred in 70 AD was the fulfillment of what the Lord prophesied during his earthly ministry. What I want to do is I want to look at this very carefully to figure out if that is true. And so there are two basic points that I want to make. The first point is this: sometimes events resemble the fulfillment of prophecy, but they are not, because they do not fulfill all of the conditions. Sometimes events resemble the fulfillment of prophecy, but they are not, because they don't fulfill all the conditions. So we'll talk about that. And then the second item is we're going to look at the verses on the destruction of the temple very carefully. So let's look at the first item. Sometimes events resemble the fulfillment of prophecy, but they are not, because they do not fulfill all the conditions. So think about this with me. If a particular event fulfills some of the conditions of prophecy, but not all of them, can it actually be the fulfillment of prophecy? It can't, for the simple reason that every prophecy in the Scriptures will be fulfilled in every detail that's specified. In other words, God's not good enough with 9 out of 10. If he prophesied A, B, C, D, E, and F will happen, and you look at something and it has A, B, and C, but not D, E, and F, then it's not the fulfillment of that prophecy. You see the point? Prophecy has to be fulfilled to even the smallest detail to actually be the fulfillment of prophecy. So let me give you a specific example of that. Get Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 24. So if we look at the dispensational chart, what I'm going to do for a minute is I'm going to hide the dispensation of grace. So if we look at the chart without the dispensation of grace, we see the prophetic timeline exactly as it would have been understood all the way up to Acts chapter 8. Now, if I add back in the dispensation of grace, let me ask you this question. Can Old Testament prophecy be fulfilled during the dispensation of grace? And the answer to that is no, because the nature of the dispensation of grace is it is an interruption of the prophetic program. It's God calling time out as to the fulfillment of the prophetic program. Therefore, no prophecy of the Old Testament can be fulfilled during the dispensation of grace. It's the same thing as the following. If I were to ask you the question, did either team score during the timeout? What is always the correct answer? No one, because there's nothing that happens during the timeout that pertains to the actual game. It's an interruption of the game. So you have Ezekiel 36. Look with me at verse 24. For I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of all countries, and will bring you into your own land. Ezekiel 36:24 is dealing with the following issue. In the Old Testament, God brings Israel into the promised land, and they are in the promised land for a period of time. But because of their disobedience, they are scattered out of the promised land. Ezekiel 36 is written at a time when Israel is not in the promised land, and it's prophesying that they will be brought back into the promised land. So let's read it one more time. For I will take you from among the heathen. That's where Israel was scattered. They were out dispersed among the heathen. For I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of all countries and will bring you into your own land. What relatively recent event do people believe is the fulfillment of Ezekiel 36:24? 1948. And it's widely thought that that's the case. Someone wrote a book about the reasons the Lord would return in 1988. Why did they pick 1988? Because it's 40 years from 1948. Apologies, I still have a cough, so I'm sorry if I'm hard to listen to. Apologies for that. People viewed Ezekiel 36:24 as being fulfilled in 1948. In the scriptures, a generation is 40 years. So people then, what did they do? The rapture will be in 1988. So here's the easiest question of the night. Did the rapture happen in 1988? It did not. So look with me. Here's an advanced study technique that I'm going to just teach you. Most people don't do this. But we're going to read the next verse. So look at verse 25. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and ye shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you. When Ezekiel 36 is fulfilled, and Israel is brought back into the land where they're gathered from all the nations, what does God do at that time? He cleanses them from all filthiness, including all of their idols. Did that happen in 1948? It obviously did not. To ask the question simply, is Israel in the land in belief? And the vast majority of the answer is no. There are some in Israel that believe, and by the way, if you have faith today, if you are a Jew today that has faith, what would you believe? The gospel of Christ. You would believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, that He's the Son of God, that He died for your sins, that He was buried, that He rose again the third day, and you would believe in salvation by grace through faith through Paul's gospel. If you actually have faith today, that's what you believe. If you don't believe that, you are not of faith. That's just the reality of it, okay? So then let me ask you this. Is Israel today in the land in faith, in belief? And the answer is no. So was Ezekiel 36:24 fulfilled in 1948? It wasn't. So you see the example, right? In other words, for prophecy to be fulfilled, you can't just pick one detail and say, okay, this detail looks like this current event, so it's the fulfillment of this prophecy. Doesn't work that way. What you have to do is you have to look at all the details that are prophesied, and if not all of the details are met, then it is not the scriptural fulfillment of prophecy because God doesn't get it kind of right. You remember being in grade school or high school and you got a 75 on a test and it wasn't great, but you passed. And you're like, fair enough, I'll live to fight another day, I'm moving on. God doesn't do things that way, right? The prophecies that are contained in the scripture will be fulfilled 100% every last detail. Okay, so now let's go to the second point. With that as our standard for fulfillment, let's look at the verses on the destruction of the temple. So get Matthew 24, verse 1. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Get Mark 13, verse 1. Mark chapter 13, verse 1. And as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? Get Luke 21, verse 5. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the different passages in the gospel where the Lord speaks of the destruction of the temple. Luke chapter 21, verse 5. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come, in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? So we've looked at the prophecy in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, 5. They deal with the temple. They deal with the Lord saying that one stone will not be left upon another. And what many folks will do is they look at those prophecies and they see that, whatever year those prophecies are given, probably slightly before AD 33, however, whatever the exact time frame, that approximate time frame. Then they look at 70 AD and they say, well, okay, this is the Lord speaks of the one stone not be left upon another. 70 AD is the destruction of the temple. This is the fulfillment of that. Let's look at some more verses, though. Get Luke 19, verse 41. And when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace. But now they are hid from thine eyes. Verse 43, For the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. Verse 43 there gives context on when the destruction of the temple occurs. It gives us the detail that the enemy shall cast a trench about thee and compass thee round. And it's the idea of Jerusalem being encircled. And so some will look at that and they'll say, well, Jerusalem was encircled, it was compassed by the Romans in 70 AD. But let me suggest this to you. Are there other verses in the Gospels that tell you what happens when Jerusalem is compassed? And the answer is there are. So notice with me, get Luke 21 and verse 20. Luke 21, verse 20. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, that's exactly like Luke 19:43. Hopefully you can see the cross-reference. Then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. Now notice what we're doing by stacking verse with verse. Luke 19:43 says that the destruction of Jerusalem occurs when it's compassed about, when it's surrounded, when it's encircled. When you go to Luke 21:20, it talks about Jerusalem being compassed, and then it tells you in verse 21, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Can you think of any other time in the Lord's earthly ministry where he talks about them in Judea fleeing to the mountains? And hopefully the answer that goes off in your mind is Matthew 24:15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. So Matthew 24:16 is a very clear cross-reference to Luke 21:21. Couldn't be more obvious. Right before Matthew 24:16, what event is it that precedes them which in Judea fleeing into the mountains? It's the abomination of desolation being set up. So that tells us something, doesn't it? Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, what event happens at that same time? The abomination of desolation is set up. Now, Matthew 24 is referring to Daniel's 70th week. So get with me, Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. Daniel chapter 9, and we'll look at verse 24. Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So verse 24 talks about 70 weeks. Verse 25 references 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So how many weeks are described in verse 25? Well, you've got 7 plus 3 score. So how much is 3 score? A score is 20. So 3 score is 60. So you have 7 plus 60, and then plus what? 2. So what does that equal? 69. Verse 25, we can see 69 of the 70 weeks referenced. Verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So when it says after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, it's obviously referring to the cross, right? That's where the Messiah is cut off, and that must be after the 69th week. Verse 26 also references the city and the sanctuary being destroyed, very similar to what we read in the Gospels. Now notice verse 27. There is 1 week that has not yet been accounted for. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. For the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. That's obviously the abomination of desolation. Even until the consummation that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Okay, so let's make sure we understand this. The moment that 2023 ends, the very next moment 2024 begins, right? That's obvious. We all understand that. Does Daniel's 70th week begin the moment after the 69th week ends? And the answer to that is no. When you look at verse 26, it says, after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off. So that's the end of the 69th week. But what does verse 27 say? And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. What starts Daniel's 70th week is the beast, the man of sin, the son of perdition, confirming the covenant with Israel for 1 week. In other words, they sign a 7-year agreement. So think of it this way. Did that 7-year agreement, did it get signed in Acts chapter 1 after the Lord was crucified? It didn't. And it didn't get signed in Acts chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what that tells you is this. The 69th week ends, and there is a natural prophetic gap before the 70th week starts. So, let me ask you this. Did the 70th week start during the first century? Was the mark of the beast imposed during the first century? Did the second coming happen during the first century? None of those things did. So here's what's going on. Let's think for a moment just about Matthew 24 and Luke 21. So Luke 21 talked about Jerusalem being compassed with armies. Matthew 24 talked about the abomination of desolation being set up. Now I want you to think with me. Why would the beast do those two events at the exact same time? Here's why. When the abomination of desolation is set up, what is believing Israel going to do? They're going to flee. So if you set up the abomination of desolation and a year later you compass Jerusalem with armies, it'd be a little late, right? Think through this. What the beast wants to do is he wants to capture believing Israel in Jerusalem, in Judea, and then do what to them? Slaughter them, right? So the reason why Jerusalem is compassed with armies and the abomination of desolation is set up at that time is the beast knows that when the abomination of desolation is set up, what will believing Israel do? They'll flee. They'll leave. So what you do is he encircles it so when they try to leave, they won't be able to get out. Okay? So now, let's tie this all together. Luke 19. When no stone is left upon another, when that happens, it's because the enemies compassed Jerusalem. In Luke 21, Jerusalem is compassed with armies right before the desolation of Jerusalem, right before the abomination of desolation. Matthew 24, what makes Jerusalem desolate is the abomination of desolation which occurs in Daniel's 70th week. In other words, the prophesied destruction of the temple is going to occur during Daniel's 70th week, and Daniel's 70th week didn't happen in the first century. Let me go back to something we started with. Is Old Testament prophecy fulfilled during the dispensation of grace? No, it's not. 70 AD was during what? The dispensation of grace. Yes? It was. Because the dispensation of grace began in Acts 9 when it was revealed to the Apostle Paul. So Acts chapter 70, the events of Acts chapter 70 occurred during the dispensation of grace, and Old Testament prophecy is not fulfilled during the dispensation of grace. What this means is this. Does the temple have to be rebuilt in the future? Yes, it does. The temple has to be rebuilt in the future, and there will be sacrifices offered in it. But what will happen in the middle of the 70th week? The man of sin is going to go into the temple. He will cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And what will he declare? Showing himself that he is God. In other words, he will go into the temple and say, your God is here. And it will be utterly blasphemous. That's the abomination of desolation. And then the temple will subsequently be destroyed. So, with regard to this destruction of the temple in AD 70, was it the fulfillment of the Lord's prophecies during his earthly ministry? No, it wasn't, and it can't be.